Our topic is a possible typological background for Daniel 11:40-45. When we look at the last verses of Daniel 11, we find this phrase, the time of the end. And Daniel 11 describes the events of the time of the end in verses 40-45. Seventh-day Adventists have not come to a settled position on the interpretation of these events, but I offer a tentative proposal building upon insights from my former seminary teachers, Hans Laurendel and William Shea. And my view is basically in harmony with the overall views of Jacques Ducan and Jiří Moskala with a slight different foundation. So first, let's think briefly about the grand theme of Daniel 10-12. We have this expressed in three key verses from this section. Daniel 10, verse 1, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar, and the word was true, and it was a great conflict. So we have this theme of a cosmic conflict, a great controversy here. And then in verse 14, the angel says, I have come to make you understand what will happen to your people in the latter days. And finally in Daniel 12, verse 1, at that time Michael shall stand up, and at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. So may I summarize this grand theme of this section is the great controversy, the great conflict involving God's people in which Christ will bring deliverance to his people at the end. Let's look briefly at the interpretive keys that I find crucial in interpreting this section of Daniel 11. And for these keys, I'm indebted to my professor, Hans Laurendel, and others that I have dealt with in my conversations and research. So at the cross, the king of the south and the king of the north are no longer taken as literal nations of Egypt and Babylon, but they are taken spiritually in relation to spiritual Israel, as the covenant is universalized in harmony with the spiritual nature of the classical enemies coming from the south, Egypt, and from the north, Babylon. And so Babylon, this king of the north, represents religious, God-usurping character, false religious powers. And there are lots of texts in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, especially in Revelation, that highlight this aspect of the king of the north, of Babylon. And then Egypt, the king of the south, is in practice a non-religious, because when everything is a god, nothing is a god, practically, self-relying power, practical atheism, and irreligion, rejection of God, all of these attributes fitting this king of the south motif. And you find this already in Exodus chapter 5 and in Isaiah and Revelation and great controversy. Also, Ellen White indicates this meaning of Egypt. I am building this brief presentation upon a brief suggestion of William Shea in his book Daniel, A Reader's Guide, pages 266 and 67. And when I first saw it, I was startled to think that this was even a possibility. But I began to look at it more, and then I went to sources such as the book From Cyrus to Alexandria, A History of the Persian Empire, Pierre Bryant, Eisenbrauns, and found historical verification for what Dr. Shea was saying. And so I offer it humbly, tentatively, as a possible typological background for this section. My thesis is this, that the Egyptian campaign of the Persian king Cambyses II in 525 BC serves as a type for the spiritual battle between good and evil in the time of the end. Now, if Daniel were still alive at this time, he would be almost 100 years old, and that's possible. Recall that Cyrus the Great, father of Cambyses II, was a type of the coming of Christ. And that was before he was king of Babylon, while he was still head of the armies that were conquering Babylon. And so he became a type of the one who brought deliverance against Babylon and delivered God's people from Babylon. So Cyrus the Great, father of Cambyses II, was the type of the coming of Christ to bring about the fall of Babylon and to liberate God's people. A positive type, a type of Christ. However, Cyrus's son, Cambyses, had taken the title King of Babylon. He now represented Babylon. And he thus seems to be a type of the final unification of spiritual Babylon with spiritual Egypt and the subjugation of the latter by the former. Cambyses sought to carry out the plan of his father when he also became king of Babylon to unite Babylon with the lands of Trans-Euphrates all the way to Egypt. World domination was his goal. Cambyses II's campaign to Egypt in 525 brought about that unique moment in history when Babylon subjugated Egypt and the neighboring countries now known as Libya and Sudan or Ethiopia, and brought about a union of Egypt and Babylon with the empire at its greatest extent ever. I believe this is a time of special interest with regard to the issues in the great controversy. We already read in Daniel 10:1 that this was a time of great conflict. And when it describes this reference to a great conflict, what follows then is a description of Christ and of the battle with the prince, the heavenly prince, and the earthly kings of Persia in verses 5 to 20. And Gabriel links the issues of the great controversy in particular with this period, with the evil prince behind the kings of Persia and the earthly kings. Ellen White comments in Prophets and Kings 5:7-1 in this way: while Satan was striving to influence the highest powers in the kingdom of Medo-Persia to show disfavor to God's people, angels worked in behalf of the exiles. The controversy was one in which all heaven was interested. This is an important moment. Through the prophet Daniel, we are given a glimpse of this mighty struggle between the forces of good and forces of evil. This sounds like language of a paradigm of the final great struggle, and I think it makes sense that the final struggle and the great controversy might use the typology of Cyrus on the positive side and Cyrus' son representing Babylon. Ellen White goes on to say, for 3 weeks, Gabriel wrestled with the powers of darkness, seeking to counteract the influences of the work on the mind of Cyrus. And before the contest closed, Christ himself came to Gabriel's aid. All that heaven could do in behalf of the people of God was done. The victory was finally gained. The forces of the enemy were held in check. Now notice, all the days of Cyrus and all the days of his son Cambyses, who reigned about 7.5 years. Note Ellen White's mentions of these two kings that were particularly involved in the great conflict. So I'd like to now go through the verses of verses 40 to 45, and let's see how the campaign of Cambyses II actually fits as historical background, typological historical background of these verses. I'm going to read the verse, a part of the verse, and then show how Cambyses' campaign fits in. Verse 40a, the king of the south will thrust at the king of the north. And we find during this time Egypt under Amasis II and his successor and his son, Psamtik III, was flexing its muscle in the region, opposing the Persian Empire. Verse 40b, the king of the north came against him, both by land and by sea. And we find that Cambyses' campaign was with chariots, cavalry, by land, and fleets of ship. And they entered the various countries on the way going south to Egypt and overflowed them and passed through, as it describes here in verse 40. Then we go to verse 41. They entered the glorious land. They passed through Judah. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. And this aptly describes the march by land down from Persia, Babylon, through Syria and Palestine, and as well as the naval route by sea, subduing Cyprus, the land of Cyprus. And then it goes on to say in verse 41, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. And it's interesting that Cambyses bypassed Transjordan, did not touch the land where these three people groups lived, but went on the coastal road to the west and did the same thing on his return. Verse 42, he will extend his powers over the countries, literally the lands, and Egypt will not escape. And several former allies of Egypt had already switched allegiance to Cambyses by this time. And in the spring of 525 BC, Cambyses was victorious over the Egyptian forces at the Battle of Pelusium on the eastern frontier of the eastern Nile Delta. He moved west and captured Memphis, where Psamtik and troops had fortified themselves, and took the pharaoh prisoner. And by summer, he was in control of all of Egypt. Verse 43a, he shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver and of all the precious things of Egypt. Cambyses was crowned king of Upper and Lower Egypt. And according to Herodotus, he looted the temples. Modern scholars think perhaps Herodotus has exaggerated this because there's no real archaeological evidence for all the looting that he describes. However, he did take control of the wealth of Egypt. That is clear. According to the Demotic Chronicle, Cambyses decreased the immense income that the Egyptian temples received from the Egyptian pharaohs and allowed only 3 main temples to keep their entitlements. Verse 43b, and the Libyans and the Cushites, that is, Nubians and Ethiopians, shall follow in his train, literally in his footsteps. It's interesting. Cambyses, after conquering Egypt, continued his conquest into the neighboring countries of North Africa, 2 countries, Libya to the west, and the Nubians, the Ethiopians, to the south. And they surrendered and paid tribute without a fight. So these are the only 2 other nations surrounding Egypt mentioned in the historical record, the same ones mentioned in the biblical prophecy. Verse 44a, news from the east and the north shall trouble him. His country of Persia, as you recall, was east, but news had to travel up around the Fertile Crescent and then down north to him through Syria and Palestine down into Egypt. History is not clear on what the troubling news was. There are many conflicting accounts, but it seems to have involved a rebellion against him in Persia. And according to the Behistun inscription written by the following king, Darius the Great, a magus named Gaumata impersonated Bardia, Cambyses' brother, and incited a revolution in Persia. Spring of 522, Cambyses hurriedly left Egypt. Verse 44b, therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. And Cambyses left Egypt in great anger to rectify the situation. Verse 45a, he shall pitch his palatial tents between the seas toward the glorious holy mountain. Cambyses did not come to the glorious holy mountain, did not come completely to it, but he only pitched his royal tents toward it. He camped in Judah on the plain of Sharon, between the seas, between the Mediterranean and the Sea of Galilee or the Dead Sea, right in the between there in the Esdraelon plain, toward the glorious holy mountain. Now there is a mountain, right at the foot of that plain, it's Mount Carmel, which may be an allusion to Harmageddon, Mount Megiddo. It's the only mountain near Megiddo is Mount Carmel. Or it could be Jerusalem between the seas that it's alluding to. 45b, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. Cambyses died as a result of a self-inflicted wound, stabbing himself in the thigh with his sword. Some historians say it was an accident, others say it was suicide. But after 20 days, he died of gangrene at a place called Agbatana, probably the modern city of Hama in Syria. None of the troops in his mighty army could help him. This is seen as retributive justice. According to Herodotus, he had killed the sacred Apis bull by stabbing it in the thigh. but other evidence seems to suggest that he had not disrespected the Apis bull and even took part in the preservation and burial ceremony of the Apis bull. According to Herodotus, Cambyses was labeled a despot by the Persians due to being half mad, cruel, and insolent. But this may have been propaganda by the Persian tribal nobility and the Egyptians because Cambyses tried to consolidate authority to himself. But what is clear is his attempt to consolidate authority and his success in unifying the territory of Babylon, Persia, with Egypt under his control as both king of Babylon and king of Egypt, Upper and Lower Egypt. He had world domination. Now, let's shift from that antitypical background to see how this would then help us in understanding the typical background. Now let's look at the antitypical fulfillment. And let's look through those same verses and see how this plays itself out in the verse-by-verse interpretation. Back to verse 40, verse A, in the time of the end. Adventists have understood this as starting in 1798, using Daniel 12, 4 through 7, and showing the interlinking there. And the king of the south thrusts at him, and we have seen the king of the south as an atheistic power, thrusting against the papal system, taking place initially at 1798 as atheistic France inflicts a deadly wound upon the papacy. But this continues on into the 20th century as atheistic communism and thrusts at the papacy. And Education, page 228, predicts a last day worldwide dissemination of the same atheistic teachings as in France. The worldwide dissemination of the same teachings, she writes, that led to the French Revolution, all are tending to involve the whole world in a struggle similar to that which convulsed France. 40, verse 40b. The king of the north shall come against him, the king of the south, and enter the countries and pass through. Here is described the unification with and subjugation of atheism, communism, irreligious secularism, and the resurgence of the papal power, world domination. Verse 41a, he shall enter the glorious land. The papacy is attacking or permeating God's true people, spiritual Israel, the glorious land. And many of God's people shall fall, shall stumble. This could either be in persecution, as it's described in 1133, or apostasy, as it's described in 1114. Then verse 41b, these shall escape. And this language, the malat in the nifel, can mean flee to safety or be left undisturbed, either one. These shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. Who are those? Edom, Moab, Ammonites were relatives of God's people, once worshipers of the true God, but apostatized. May I suggest these represent apostate Protestantism? Many will flee to safety from the power of the papacy, from Protestant ranks, and join God's people, or alternatively, if you take the other meaning of the Hebrew word malat, they will be left undisturbed because they are already subservient to the papacy. Verse 42, he, the king of the north, will stretch out his hand against the countries. This is absolute language. The countries, the world, and the land of Egypt. Atheism, secularism will not escape. Papacy unites and dominates the world. And then verse 43a, he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. Dukan in his Daniel 11 Decoded, I think, captures this when he describes how the papacy will subjugate the various secular and philosophical powers which deny God, will take control over the richness of all of their ideas and their machinations. He will take control over all the spiritual forces. 43b, the Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. It's interesting as you do a study of the Libyans and Ethiopians, they were both practicers of a mixture of traditional animist and Egyptian religion, including a cult of the dead, the Libyans, thus heavily influenced by spiritualistic beliefs. Could it be that they are following at the heels of the papacy, giving it support as a spiritualistic power? So I'm suggesting the possibility here we have a threefold union of the papacy, the king of the north, apostate Protestantism, Edom, Moab, Ammon, and spiritualism, pagan Libya and Ethiopia. And see Revelation 16:13, where it describes these three unclean spirits, and Ellen White's quotation in Great Controversy 588, the Protestants of the United States will be foremost in stretching their hands across the gulf to grasp the hand of spiritualism. They will reach over the abyss to clasp hands with the Roman power, and under the influence of this threefold union, this country will follow in the steps of Rome in trampling on the rights of conscience. Verse 44, news from the east and the north. Well, that's described in Revelation chapter 16 with the news going back to the Cyrus typology. The news that Babylon is going to fall and God's people are going to be delivered. This is the loud cry message concerning the coming of Christ, the antitypical Cyrus that's going to deliver his people. The north and the east are the directions that are mentioned in Scripture, the directions where deliverance comes for God's people. Isaiah 41, 42, Revelation, several passages. So he, the king of the north, the papacy, shall go forth with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. Here is the death decree. In verse 45a, he, the papacy, shall plant his royal tents between the seas. Revelation 17:15, that's the supporters of Babylon. The rivers of the Euphrates were waters that were divided up into canals that gave the life support to Babylon, called here the seas, the waters. He shall plant his tents between the seas, the supporters of Babylon, toward the glorious holy mountain. Amid the support of the nations, the papacy will focus upon the destruction of God's people. Psalm 87, Isaiah 11, Zechariah, Ephesians, Revelation, all these passages describe this experience. And finally, verse 45, the glorious holy mountain is God's people, the spiritual Jerusalem, the Holy Land. The historical events of Cambyses, with him planting his tents just at the foot of Mount Carmel, may also suggest an echo of Revelation 16:16, Armageddon, the mountain of Megiddo, where the final battle of the forces between good and evil are conducted. Verse 45b, yet he shall come to his end, the final end of the papacy, and there shall be none to help. The nations, the people, will turn against the papacy. Revelation 17:16. And then comes this grand announcement in chapter 12:1. At time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. There shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And in that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. The great conflict has a happy ending. God wins the war. Amen.